dedicated to journalists whose persistence hunting the facts makes possible our democracy. In 1838, Abraham Lincoln asked his fellow Americans, "At what point shall we expect the approach of danger? By what means shall we fortify against it? Passion has helped us, but can do so no more. It will in future be our enemy. Reason, cold, calculating, unimpassioned reason, must furnish all the materials for our future support and defense. Let those materials be molded into general intelligence, sound morality, and in particular a reverence for the Constitution and laws, and that we improve to the last, that we remained free to the last, that we revered his name to the last, that during his long sleep we permitted no hostile foot to pass over or desecrate his resting place, shall be that which to learn the last trump shall awaken our Washington." Posiwid, the purpose of a system is what it does. System theorists coined an acronym to separate beguiling beliefs from real-world facts. Rather than being seduced by what a system is intended to do, they focus on what it in fact does. Posiwid, the purpose of a system is what it does. Posiwid, demoralization, destabilization, crisis, and normalization. 100 years ago, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, better known as Lenin, served as head of government of Soviet Russia from 1917 to 1924. Lenin said, "A lie told often enough becomes the truth." All over the world, wherever there are capitalists, freedom of the press means freedom to buy up newspapers, to buy writers, to bribe, buy, and fake public opinion. Man's consciousness not only reflects the objective world, but creates it. A newspaper is not only a collective propagandist and a collective agitator, it is also a collective organizer. Sometimes history needs a push. Ralph Waldo Emerson spoke to his fellow Americans about the stark choice between truth and repose in words that resonate today. God offers to every mind its choice between truth and repose. Take which you please, you can never have both. Between these, as a pendulum, man oscillates. He in whom the love of repose predominates will accept the first creed, the first philosophy, the first political party he meets, most likely his father's. He gets rest, commodity, and reputation, but he shuts the door of truth. He in whom the love of truth predominates will keep himself aloof from all moorings and afloat. He will abstain from dogmatism and recognize all the opposite negations between which, as walls, his being is swung. He submits to the inconvenience of suspense and imperfect opinion, but he is a candidate for truth, as the other is not, and respects the highest law of his being. June 8, 1978. Here in part is the 1978 Harvard University commencement address, titled The Exhausted West, or A World Split Apart, by exiled writer, philosopher, and outspoken critic of the Soviet Union, Alexander Solzhenitsyn.
Harvard's motto is Veritas. Many of you have already found out, and others will find out in the course of their lives, that truth eludes us if we do not concentrate our attention totally on its pursuit. But even while it eludes us, the illusion of knowing it still lingers and leads to many misunderstandings. Also, truth seldom is pleasant. It is almost invariably bitter. There is some bitterness in my today's speech too, but I want to stress that it comes not from an adversary, but from a friend. A decline in courage may be the most striking feature which an outside observer notices in the West in our days. The Western world has lost its civil courage, both as a whole and separately in each country, each government, each political party, and of course in the United Nations. Political and intellectual bureaucrats show depression, passivity, and perplexity in their actions and in their statements, and even more so in theoretical reflections to explain how realistic, reasonable, as well as intellectually and even morally warranted it is to base state policies on weakness and cowardice. Should one point out that from ancient times decline in courage has been considered the beginning of the end? When the modern Western states were created, the principle was proclaimed that governments are meant to serve man, and man lives to be free and to pursue happiness. See, for example, the American Declaration of Independence. Now, at last, during past decades, technical and social progress has permitted the realization of such aspirations, the welfare state. Every citizen has been granted the desired freedom and material goods in such quantity and of such quality as to guarantee in theory the achievement of happiness in the morally inferior sense of the word which has come into being during those same decades. In the process, however, one psychological detail has been overlooked: the constant desire to have still more things and a still better life, and the struggle to obtain them imprint many Western faces with worry and even depression, though it is customary to conceal such feelings. Active and tense competition fills all human thoughts without opening a way to free spiritual development. Western society has given itself the organization best suited to its purposes, based, I would say, on the letter of the law. The limits of human rights and righteousness are determined by a system of laws. Such limits are very broad. People in the West have acquired considerable skill in interpreting and manipulating law. Any conflict is solved according to the letter of the law, and this is considered to be the supreme solution. If one is right from a legal point of view, nothing more is required. Nobody may mention that one could still not be entirely right, and urge self-restraint, a willingness to renounce such legal rights, sacrifice, and selfless risk. It would sound simply absurd. One almost never sees voluntary self-restraint. Everybody operates at the extreme limit of those legal frames. It is time in the West to defend not so much human rights as human obligations. Destructive and irresponsible freedom has been granted boundless space. Society appears to have little defense against the abyss of human decadence, such as, for example, misuse of liberty for moral violence against young people, such as motion pictures full of pornography, crime, and horror. It is considered to be part of freedom and theoretically counterbalanced by the young people's right not to look or not to accept. Life organized legalistically has thus shown its inability to defend itself against the corrosion of evil. And what shall we say about criminality as such? Legal frames, especially in the United States, are broad enough to encourage not only individual freedom, but also certain individual crimes. The culprit can go unpunished or obtain undeserved leniency with the support of thousands of public defenders. There are meaningful warnings which history gives a threatened or perishing society. Such are, for instance, the decadence of art or a lack of great statesmen. There are open and evident warnings, too. The smooth surface film must be very thin then. The social system quite unstable and unhealthy. But the fight for our planet, physical and spiritual, a fight of cosmic proportions, is not a vague matter of the future. It has already started. The forces of evil have begun their offensive. You can feel their pressure, and yet your screens and publications are full of prescribed smiles and raised glasses. What is the joy about? Very well-known representatives of your society, such as George Kennan, say, we cannot apply moral criteria to politics. Thus, we mix good and evil, right and wrong, and make space for the absolute triumph of absolute evil in the world. On the contrary, only moral criteria can help the West against communism's well-planned world strategy. There are no other criteria. Practical or occasional considerations of any kind will inevitably be swept away by strategy. After a certain level of the problem has been reached, legalistic thinking induces paralysis. It prevents one from seeing the size and meaning of events. In spite of the abundance of information, or maybe because of it, the West has difficulties in understanding reality such as it is. Western thinking has become conservative. The world situation should stay as it is at any cost. There should be no changes. This new way of thinking, which had imposed on us its guidance, did not admit the existence of intrinsic evil in man, nor did it see any higher task than the attainment of happiness on earth. It based modern Western civilization on the dangerous trend to worship man and his material needs. However, in early democracies, as in the American democracy at the time of its birth, all individual human rights were granted because man is God's creature. That is, freedom was given to the individual conditionally, in the assumption of his constant religious responsibility. Such was the heritage of the preceding 1,000 years. 200 or even 50 years ago, it would have seemed quite impossible in America that an individual could be granted boundless freedom simply for the satisfaction of his instincts or whim. Facing such a danger, with such splendid historical values in your past, at such a high level of realization of freedom and of devotion to freedom, how is it possible to lose to such an extent the will to defend oneself?
The equal time rule originated in 1927. It was created out of the concern that broadcast stations could easily manipulate the outcome of elections by presenting just one point of view and excluding other candidates. The equal time rule applies to the political candidate only. The Zappel Doctrine was a provision of the FCC's Fairness Doctrine, adopted in 1949. It expanded the scope to include the campaign's spokespeople and supporters, not just the candidate. In 1987, the Fairness Doctrine policy was eliminated by the Federal Communications Commission. One would have supposed that a trial judge, convinced though he was of the guilt of the Rosenbergs, would have set aside such prosecutorial hyperbole as a convention of the contest, rather like the grunts of wrestlers. That the Rosenbergs had sought secrets of immeasurable importance, one could readily believe. That they had in fact secured such secrets from the likes of David Greenglass was a matter of some conjecture. As for the reference to the Korean War, who would have imagined that Judge Irving R. Kaufman would have surpassed the prosecutor in rhetorical extravagance? Yet he said in justifying his sentence to the defendants, "I believe your conduct in putting into the hands of the Russians the A-bomb years before our best scientists predicted Russia would perfect the bomb has already caused, in my opinion, the communist aggression in Korea, with the resultant casualties exceeding 50,000, and who knows but that millions more of innocent people may pay the price for your treason." For their part in this diabolical conspiracy to destroy a God-fearing nation, and as an example to others, Judge Kaufman, having passed a prayerful period in a synagogue, condemned the couple to death. The trial was over. The cause was born. On the ferocious right, there was satisfaction. Veterans organizations concurred with their usual bonhomie. Pickets carried signs, "Death to the communist rats." For the communists and their accustomed allies, the position was equally clear. 2 innocents were being victimized by America's witch hunters. As appeal followed fruitless appeal through the courts, 27 months passed between sentence and execution. The apparatus of protest went into gear. Mass rallies, petitions, conferences, White House vigils, pleas by clergymen and relatives of Bartolomeo Vanzetti and Captain Dreyfus, all the paraphernalia of organized spontaneity. Had the Rosenbergs been sentenced to a prison term, there would have been protests too, in those dusty East Side meeting halls where political outlanders assembled to excite themselves during that difficult period. But the threatened execution of a man and wife in their 30s, leaving behind 2 sons, this young couple, a European sympathizer would write after the execution, united in death by a frightful sentence which made orphans of their innocent children, was enough to touch many thousands with less vigorous political allegiances. In France especially, garden-variety anti-Americanism, coupled with honest compassion, produced a swelling chorus of pleas for mercy, into which denunciations of this country were often fitted. "Watch out! America has the rabies," exhorted Jean-Paul Sartre a day after the executions. "Cut all ties which bind us to her, otherwise we will in turn be bitten and run mad." On the domestic left, there were sharp splits. In November 1952, after the conviction of the Rosenbergs had been affirmed by the Court of Appeals, Arthur Garfield Hayes, then General Counsel of the American Civil Liberties Union, wrote in The Nation, "It is the damnable death penalty that causes the uneasiness." There was no precedent for such a penalty in such a case, he observed. And he warned, if this judgment is carried through, we shall make martyrs of the Rosenbergs. But for a part of the left, including, it must be noted, the condemned couple themselves, martyrdom was not unwelcome. "We are the first victims of American fascism," Ethel Rosenberg would write in her last letter to Attorney Block. Most of the country, including such ordinarily liberal newspapers as the St. Louis Dispatch, stood by the sentence of death. Many of the liberals who called for commutation took pains to divorce themselves from the argument that the Rosenbergs were victims of a frame-up. The New Republic characterized the frame-up charge as nonsense and took the position that the Rosenbergs ought to have their sentences commuted despite adequate evidence of their guilt. That more liberals did not come out more forcefully for the Rosenbergs has been attributed to sheer fright. They were allegedly scared witless by Joe McCarthy. The explanation is somewhat simple. The charge of being communist, which had once aroused the wrath of New Dealers, now, after the Hiss affair, and the fellow traveling of Henry Wallace, gave rise to an anxious inner scrutiny. As Nathan Glazier remarked, one could ask for mercy, and many people who believe the Rosenbergs guilty did, but certainly many others must have recoiled from becoming involved in a communist campaign based on lies. The official campaign was of a pattern with the Stockholm Peace Appeal and the protest against alleged U.S. germ warfare in Korea, other large-scale efforts of the early 50s to exploit the emotions of millions for the benefit of Soviet policy. Dorothy Thompson, who spoke out against the death sentence, suggested that the high-pressure tactics were designed to make it impossible for U.S. officials to relent, and so to assure the communist cause a couple of martyrs. In a similar spirit, the liberal Catholic Commonwealth wrote in February 1953 after the Pope had issued an appeal for clemency. Part of the great tragedy of the Rosenberg case has been its cynical exploitation by communist groups. But some men of goodwill, men neither motivated nor duped by communist polemic, and with no doubt of the Rosenbergs' guilt, would deny the communists their martyrs and have urged mercy in the name of prudence. The charge that the Rosenbergs were victims of anti-Semitism was a favorite amongst their supporters. Nearly all the principals in their trial, defendants, witnesses, prosecutor Irving H. Sapol, abetted by Roy M. Cohn, Judge Irving R. Kaufman, were Jewish. as if to compensate for the imbalance, not a single Jew sat on the jury. The Washington Rosenberg Committee declared in 1952 that a growing wave of terror had begun against the Jewish people in the wake of the trial. And a release to the Jewish press from William L. Patterson, Executive Secretary of the Civil Rights Congress, warned, "The lynching of these two innocent American Jews, unless stopped by the American people, will serve as a signal for a wave of Hitler-like genocidal attacks against the Jewish people throughout the United States." No newspaper used this release, however, and papers such as the New York Post and columnists such as Max Lerner, with large liberal Jewish followings, gave the lie to an argument that was patently designed to draw attention away from the ongoing persecutions of the Stalin regime. Where in all this were Julius and Ethel Rosenberg? The sinister picture painted by the prosecution rang as false as the shining portrait created and distributed by their promoters. Two Immortals was the heading of a daily worker series devoted to the memories of a couple who could use the word communist only in quotation marks. The early 1950s were a time of toughness for liberal intellectuals, an antidote to many years of softness. The Rosenbergs, then, came through as total servants of an ideological commitment, who thought and felt whatever that commitment required of them. Thus, though treason might be a crime in bourgeois eyes, if carried out for their overreaching principle, the defense of the Soviet Union, there was no real crime to it. And so they were innocent, they were victims. The betrayal of their essential humanity by their comrades and themselves left the burden of its defense with us. This obligation we failed, and our failure must be faced up to. Before the eyes of the world, we lost an opportunity concretely to assert what all our abstract declarations can never prove. That for us at least, the suffering person is realer than the political moment that produces him or the political philosophy for which he stands. Surely it is not even a paradox to assert that it is our special duty to treat as persons, as real human beings, those who most blasphemously deny their own humanity. The Rosenberg cause was kept fitfully in the public memory during the 1950s by a few books from unsurprising sources and advances in the careers of Judge Kaufman, appointed to the Court of Appeals, Prosecutor Sapol, made a judge, and Roy Cohn, recruited by Joe McCarthy. Roy Marcus Cohn said, "I bring out the worst in my enemies. That's how I get them to defeat themselves." If Sidney Zion's autobiography of Roy Cohn and Nicholas von Hoffman's Citizen Cohn have it right, Roy Cohn was one of the most curious child prodigies ever born. Moreover, he was trapped throughout his life inside his own early precociousness. Many others were trapped with him along the way. One of them was Joe McCarthy. McCarthy never knew what he was dealing with. He didn't destroy himself, as it is so often put. He was unable to survive Cohn's prodigious obsessions. Most child prodigies are pint-sized musicians, artists, poets, dancers, mathematicians, or chess players. Mr. Cohn was a child political prodigy. His talent was not for political science either. It was politics as practiced in the Bronx County Courthouse in the 1930s, where the rules of the favor bank, with its IOUs and contracts, were the only rules that applied. By his own account, as well as Mr. von Hoffman's, Cohn had no boyhood. He was raised as a miniature adult. His father, Albert Cohn, was a judge in the Bronx and a big mocker, a very big deal, in the Bronx Democratic Organization, which in turn, under the famous Edward J. Boss Flynn, had a pivotal position in the National Democratic Party. Cohn grew up in an apartment on Walton Avenue, just down the street from the courthouse, near the crest of the Grand Concourse, watching big mockers coming and going through the living room, transacting heavy business with his father. "I didn't hang around arguing with my buddies about whether DiMaggio was better than Mel Ott," says Cohn. His idea of recreation was discussing with his father interesting cases that had come before his court. He claims he was only 8 when the force of his logic changed forever the judge's attitude towards eyewitness testimony. At the age of 10, Roy was introduced by his father, Al Cohn, a respected Bronx and then New York State Supreme Court judge, to FDR. Roy, who began speaking at political rallies at the age of 9, promptly informed the president he agreed with his court-packing schemes. At 12, he says, he got into a serious argument with the old man over the proper operations of the favor bank. Judge Cohn had ascended to the appellate division thanks to the political machinations of another judge, Francis Martin. So Al Cohn had a big marker out, an IOU outstanding collectible by Francis Martin. 2 years later, Judge Martin came to Al Cohn and asked him to vote his way in a case before the appellate division. Al Cohn refused, saying his conscience wouldn't allow it. Both Roy and his mother, Dora Marcus Cohn, descended on Al, saying he had broken the law of the favor bank. When it came time to pay up on a marker as big as the one Al Cohn had out to Francis Martin, that was a contract. You had no choice but to pay up on a contract, at least in the eyes of Roy Marcus Cohn, age 12. Cohn says he was 15 when he pulled off his first major piece of power brokerage. Using his uncle Bertie Marcus's connections, he acted as intermediary in the purchase of a radio station, WHOM, by Generoso Pope, father of one of Cohn's schoolmates. Generoso Pope Sr. had immigrated to the United States in 1906, in tandem with Tammany Hall. Bosses and Cosa Nostra connections rose to become the most influential man in American politics as a kingmaker for Mussolini, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, J. Edgar Hoover, and Pope Pius XII. According to Cohn, Pope gave him a $10,000 commission, and Cohn kicked back a portion of it to a lawyer for the Federal Communications Commission, an FCC kickback at age 15. Generoso Gene Pope Jr. later purchased the New York Enquirer for $75,000 with a loan from his godfather Frank Costello in 1952, and converted the failing newspaper into a successful tabloid and changed its name to the National Enquirer in 1957. By age 16 or 17, according to Mr. von Hoffman, Cohn thought nothing of calling a police precinct to fix a speeding ticket for one of his high school teachers. At 18, in the last year of the Second World War, says Mr. von Hoffman, Mr. Cohn avoided the draft by having himself nominated to West Point 3 times in a row by a friendly congressman and failing the Academy's minimum strength and endurance test 3 times in a row, eating up time until the war and the draft were over. Young Roy Cohn tried 3 times to get into the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He didn't make it, but one result of these attempts to become an Army cadet was that twice Mr. Cohn was deferred from the draft, once in the closing months of World War II and again in 1946. Mr. Cohn said he was not in danger of being drafted at the times he sought entrance into West Point in 1945 and 1946, but Mr. Cohn emphasized that his memory was not entirely clear on this point. Roy Cohn's 18th birthday was February 20th, 1945. We were fighting Germany and Japan, and 18-year-olds were being drafted. New York Select Service records show young Cohn registered for the draft on his 18th birthday. 2 weeks later, on March 7, 1945, Mr. Cohn was classified as 1A, eligible for military service, by his local draft board. But, under the laws then in effect, a young man who had been nominated by a member of Congress for the Military Academy was deferred from the draft until it was decided whether he was acceptable for West Point. Army records in the Pentagon show that on the same week Mr. Cohn got his 1A draft classification, he was nominated for West Point by Benjamin Rabin, then a Democratic representative representing New York's 24th District. And the New York Draft Board records show that as a result, on March 24, 1945, Mr. Cohn was reclassified to 4B status, meaning that, as an Academy nominee, he could not be drafted. An Army official confirmed that Mr. Cohn originally hoped to start at West Point with the class formed in July 1945. According to the Army records, Mr. Cohn subsequently was rejected as physically unqualified for West Point, where physical standards were much higher than those for draftees. The New York Selective Service files back the Army record, showing Mr. Cohn was 4B, deferred as a West Point nominee, from March 24th to August 5th, 1945. Then he became 1A again, for a while. World War II fighting ended in August 1945, but the draft went on. According to Army officials, a few weeks later, Representative Rabin nominated Mr. Cohn for West Point a second time, this time for entrance with the cadet class to be formed in July 1946. But again, the Army notes he failed to pass the West Point physical. Bearing that out, New York draft files show that young Cohn was classified 4B for the second time from April to August 21, 1946, when he becomes 1A again. The Army records are that Mr. Cohn was nominated for the third time by Representative Rabin sometime in 1946 as a potential member of the Academy class to start in July 1947. In October 1946, according to the Army records, Mr. Cohn's third and last nomination to the Military Academy was withdrawn by Representative Rabin. There is nothing in Mr. Cohn's selective service record to indicate he was classified 4B for a third time. Colonel Candler Cobb, New York's Vice Director of Selective Service, said, Mr. Cohn's record shows that he remained 1A after August 21, 1946. His 1A status was appealed in October 1946. I am not allowed by law to divulge why, but it's not important anyhow because we never acted on the appeal. You see, we quit drafting people late in 1946, and the draft went out of existence soon after that. On June 22, 1948, Mr. Cohn registered as a private with the New York National Guard. 2 days later, President Truman signed into law a bill calling for a new draft. Mr. Cohn received a draft-exempt status because of his National Guard membership. A reporter asked Mr. Cohn, "At any time that you attempted to get into West Point, was a draft board breathing down your neck?" Mr. Cohn said, "My recollection is no, but I wouldn't want to say that categorically without checking the records." Ex-Representative Rabin had become a New York State Supreme Court justice. Justice Rabin said, "I don't remember the details, but it seems to me I nominated Cohn in 2 successive years. I may have nominated him 2 or 3 times. I don't recall the exact years, but it was between 1945 and 1948, for that is when I was in Congress. As I recall it, Cohn failed his physical at least once. The last time I renominated him after his doctor had told me he thought Cohn could pass the physical if he got another chance. Then, as I recall it, I ascertained that Cohn wouldn't be able to pass the physical, so I called him in and we talked it over and decided to withdraw the nomination." Mr. Cohn's recollection was similar. "I had a deviated septum, nasal trouble, you know. That and some other minor ailments kept me out. After graduating from Columbia Law School at 20, he became an assistant U.S. attorney and an expert in subversive activities. In the 1951 espionage trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, Roy Cohn persuaded the star witness Ethel Rosenberg's brother, David Greenglass, to change his testimony." By age 23, Cohn was center stage for the so-called trial of the century, the prosecution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg for delivering atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. For a start, says Cohn, at age 21 he had taken part in a complicated piece of favor banking involving Tammany Hall and one of its men's auxiliaries, the mob, to get Irving Sapol his job as United States Attorney. Sapol became the prosecutor in the Rosenberg case and made Cohn his first lieutenant. Next, says Cohn, he did some favor banking for an old family friend, Irving Kaufman. Al Cohn had played a big part in getting Judge Kaufman a federal judgeship. Now Judge Kaufman was dying to preside at the trial of the century. Cohn says he went straight to the clerk in charge of assigning judges to criminal cases, pulled the right strings, and Judge Kaufman was in. Throughout the trial, says Cohn, he and Judge Kaufman kept in secret communication. Judge Kaufman, he says, would go out on the street and use a telephone booth next to the Park Avenue Synagogue. Cohn would take the call at a booth behind the judge's bench in the courtroom. Before his death in 1986, Mr. Cohn told Mr. Zion, if the Rosenbergs had a communication system like Irving had, they never would have been caught, let alone executed. An American Bar Association committee exonerated both men of any improper conduct in 1977. How much of Cohn's version is true, and how much is just big talk? Either way, it offers a clue to Cohn's purpose in deciding at the 11th hour to leave an autobiography behind. McCarthy was not destroyed because he made wild charges concerning communist influence in America. As polls showed repeatedly, so long as he stuck to that broad theme, he had tremendous bipartisan support. It was the sons of 2 established Democratic Party families who vied for the position of chief counsel to McCarthy's Senate Subcommittee on Internal Security. One was Roy Cohn, the other was Bobby Kennedy. Kennedy signed on as an assistant counsel, and Cohn treated him like a gopher, making him go out for sweet rolls and coffee refills, earning his eternal hatred. What did McCarthy in was his attack on the United States Army. It was Dwight Eisenhower's army, and by now, 1953, Eisenhower was president of the United States. And who got McCarthy into his last, ruinous, tarball battle with the Army? The Little Prince. Cohn had brought aboard the McCarthy team as an unpaid special investigator, one G. David Schine, the rich young handsome blonde son of a hotel chain operator. Mr. Schine's only qualification for the job was that he had written an amateurish tract entitled Definition of Communism and published it with his own money. Not even McCarthy knew why he was there. He only kept him on to make Cohn happy. McCarthy seemed to think that Cohn, in addition to being bright and energetic, was highly organized, tightly wound, cool, and disciplined as well. He wasn't. What baby autocrat would live like that? Cohn and Mr. Schine proceeded to become a pair of bold-faced characters in the gossip columns, two boys out on the town, throwing a party that stretched from the Stork Club in New York to various dives, high and low, in Paris, where they arrived during a disastrous European tour, supposedly to monitor the work of United States government libraries abroad. The European press mocked them unmercifully, depicting them as a pair of nitwit children. What did Cohn see in Mr. Schine? Almost immediately, there were rumors that they were lovers, and even that McCarthy himself was in on the game. Cohn's obsession with Mr. Schine, in light of what became known about Cohn in the 1980s, is one thing. But so far as Mr. Schine is concerned, there has never been the slightest evidence that he was anything but a good-looking kid who was having a hell of a good time and a hell of a good cause. In any event, the rumors were sizzling away when the Army-McCarthy hearings, the denouement of Joe McCarthy's career, got underway in 1954. Roy Cohn has reason to be pleased. He has survived more crises than Richard Nixon. In the early 50s, he was the arrogant, red-baiting counsel to Senator Joseph McCarthy, the 26-year-old who threatened to wreck the Army if favored treatment was not granted his friend David Schine. Bonnie, and Clyde is how Lillian Hellman referred to Cohn, Schine, and McCarthy. In the 60s, he was indicted 4 times. The first case ended in a mistrial, and always acquitted. He has suffered several judicial reprimands for unethical conduct, had his wrist slapped in civil cases, and been ordered to make restitution. In the 70s, he has been indicted for violating Illinois banking laws. The Internal Revenue Service has audited his income tax returns for the last 19 years and seized some of his assets. Mr. Cohn has been the target of criticism and innuendo about his ethics, his finances, his personal life. He has even been accused of conspiring to murder a young man. Roy Cohn, it is said, is the personification of evil. Actually, Roy Cohn personifies the problems of the law. Of all the attributes of a good lawyer, cynicism is certainly among the foremost. How else could one weave a defense for a client who is guilty? Like mock UN assemblies for college kids, one day you argue the Soviet Union's position, the next, the United States. What you say has little to do with what you believe. In fact, convictions can get in the way. You are an advocate, not a judge. Your interest is form, not content, the process. Surprising the prosecution, entertaining the jury, flattering the judge, leaking information to the press, figuring out angles, coaching testimony, unearthing sympathetic witnesses, feigning anger or sorrow. They're all part of the game. Roy just plays the game harder, tougher, makes up his own rules. He does what he has to win, observes a former associate, comparing him to Richard Nixon's favorite football coach. It's the George Allen School of Law. He'll pull out some plays every now and then that aren't in the book. This has earned Roy considerable notoriety. Unlike most lawyers, Mr. Cohn is not press shy. The more publicity Roy generates, the more clients he attracts. Mr. Cohn said, "I'm a ham." The more you say he's a ruthless bastard, chuckles his law partner Stanley Friedman, the more it helps. Has publicity, much of it negative, helped? All of this has done me a lot of good. There's no question about it, admits Mr. Cohn. I'd be a liar if I denied it. It's given me a reputation for being tough, a reputation for being a winner. A former assistant U.S. attorney who still believes Roy should be behind bars put it another way. He's the only person I've ever known as a prosecutor who enjoyed being indicted. He enjoys the limelight. The publicity almost guarantees that Roy's phone calls will be returned. I can get attention, no question about it, says Cohn. They know my name. The usual response is, "What did I do?" His standard technique is to dispatch a threatening letter on behalf of a client. Hey, mister, this is now the 11th hour before the monster strikes, is how Roy puts it. Roy symbolizes viciousness in protecting a client or going after someone who needs viciousness to right a wrong, says Bill Fugazi. He fights his cases as if they were his own. It is war. If he feels his adversary has been unfair, it is war to the death. No white flags, no Mr. Nice Guy. Prospective clients who want to kill their husband, torture a business partner, break the government's legs, hire Roy Cohn. Mr. Cohn is a legal executioner, the toughest, meanest, loyalist, vilest, and one of the most brilliant lawyers in America. He is not a very nice man. Cohn said, "Law is an adversarial profession. One side wins and one side loses, and I don't like to lose. I hate to lose." In June 2020, on Northeast Public Radio, Ian Pickus spoke with Ivy Mirapool before the premiere of Bully Coward Victim, The Story of Roy Cohn, her new documentary on HBO. Ms. Mirapool is the granddaughter of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, American citizens who were convicted of spying on behalf of the Soviet Union by prosecutor Roy Cohn and executed by the federal government of the United States by electric chair. The connection Ms. Mirapool documents between Cohn and Trump goes beyond mere fellow travelers. It was the relationship of a master and apprentice. Ms. Mirapool said this union became so much more than Cohn just being Trump's attorney. They became close friends. They, at certain periods of their relationship, they talked on the phone like 5 times a day. They socialized together, they went out together. But then, what happened? Cohn really started to see that he could shape Trump's future and shape Trump's position, and that would be advantageous, of course, to Cohn. So he introduced Trump to all of his Washington connections. And as Cohn became the biggest fundraiser and organizer in New York for the Reagan campaign, he simultaneously brought Trump into that circle. And what we discovered, making the film through the excellent journalist Lois Romano from the Washington Post, is that Cohn really started to plant the idea in Trump's head and connect them to all the right people to get there so that Trump could be a major figure on the national stage himself. So he starts thinking he could be the nuclear arms negotiator. And now, this is during the Cold War. And we are, there's Trump who hasn't shown any sign of expertise or even interest in any kind of major policy issues. There's Cohn going on TV and setting up an interview. He set it up themselves because he was friendly with Lois Romano. He said, "You need to interview this guy, Donald Trump from New York." And that began, and I feel like we really pinpointed almost the moment where Trump started thinking, hey, I could do this. Trump says yes to Lois Romano as she's interviewing him. "I could learn everything I need to know about nuclear missiles in an hour and a half." We recognize that person. And he also gets to know people like Roger Stone and Paul Manafort, who would play such an outsized role down the line. That's right. They're all brought together, and Cohn is the linchpin